Let's take a look and see how these identity features are implemented and how we can make use of them by starting at the lowest level. We'll look at the database to see where information like this username is stored. And that's easy enough to do. If I come into Visual Studio and I go into the toolbar and select this button that says Show All Files, then I can look inside of the App Data folder and see that there is a SQL Server database file here. ASP.NET-identity appears to have some sort of timestamp in it, but I know it's SQL Server because it ends with an MDF extension. Now the first question you might have is, how can I rename that database and make something sensible out of it, something friendly looking? But before we do that, let's look inside of it. So if I double click that file, that should open it in the Server Explorer window of Visual Studio. It's from here where I can drill in and see all the tables that are here. There's a migration history table, which is a clue that this is using the entity framework. We'll get to that. Let's look at ASP.NET roles. There's not going to be anything inside this table because we currently don't have any roles. We have no claims either. We have no logins. Logins are for third-party authentication providers like Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook. Information about those logins will be stored in this table. ASP.NET user roles is a mapping table that you can use to find out what users are in which roles. And then there's the ASP.NET users table itself, which we can open that up and show the table data. And I can see, indeed, there is a user currently in the database, S. Allen. There's a hashed password here that will be used when the user attempts to log in. So this is the database that's created by default by the identity components. And I'll show you the piece that makes that happen. But first, what about this database? How do I control the name? How do I control where that database is stored? If you go into the web.config file, then the ASP.NET identity components are configured to use the default connection string by default. You can change the name of the connection string that they look at, but out of the box it's going to be this default connection string. This is provided for us when we create a new MVC application. You can see the connection string points to a SQL Server local DB instance, and it's attaching a database in the data directory, and it has that strange name with the timestamp in it. What if I want this database to be just identity? Well, then I could change the name to be just identity.mdf, and I would probably want to change the initial catalog to also be just identity. That's the name of the database as you would see it in a database management tool. And with those changes in place, I can save the web.config, rerun the application. It's going to automatically create that new database for me. But I'll just point out, I could change this connection string to anything. I could point it to a different server. I could even change over to using SQL Compact if I wanted to. But for right now, I'll leave this in SQL Server Local DB. I'll leave it in the App Data folder. Let's run the application again. And the first point I'll point out is that even though we're using a new database, the application still knows who I am. And that might make you think that it's still using the old database, but it's really not. What happens is that this form of authentication is implemented using cookies. So there's a cookie in my browser where there's encrypted information that identifies me, and that cookie is still around in the browser. So when I make this request to ASP.NET, something pulls that cookie out of the HTTP message, looks inside and sees that this is S. Allen making this request. But if I log off and try to log back in, I'll discover that I cannot, even when I use the proper username, because we are now pointing to a newly created database that has no users inside of it. I will have to go in and register again. And I can verify that by coming back into Visual Studio, going to Solution Explorer, and refreshing this directory. There's my new database, identity.mdf. Now I want to show you something that gets people into trouble all the time, and that's this. Quite often you'll be working with these local DB databases, and you'll shut down the machine. You'll shut down the web server, which did shut down when Visual Studio went down. And then you'll be poking around your file system, and you'll come across this project in the app data folder, and you'll look at this and say, oh yeah, there's all these databases in here, but that was just test users. I don't really need them. I know the application recreates these databases from scratch when it needs to, so I'm just going to delete them all. And then I come back in to work on the application, and I try to run the application, and I go to a page that's going to need access to a database, like the logon page, and I'll find that I get the yellow screen of death. Cannot attach the file identity.mdf. And this can happen in scenarios where you delete MDF files from the file system, but you do not go into SQL Server and tell SQL Server that you've deleted the database. Now, sometimes it can detect this and it can pick it up. It can do that, for instance, if you delete things while it is running. So if I was to delete that database from the app data folder here in Visual Studio, I should be safe because SQL Server will detect that the MDF file was removed and it will remove this database from its collection of databases that it knows about. But what do I do when I get into this situation? Well, it's a little bit tricky. You're going to need some sort of tool like SQL Server Management Studio to be able to connect to SQL Server Local DB and tell it to remove that database. In this version of Visual Studio, there is a SQL Server Object Explorer that I can use to do this. So I go to View, SQL Server Object Explorer. I'll tell it that I want to connect to localDB/v11. If that entry was not present, please add a connection to SQL Server with this name, localDB version 11. But that connection is already here, and if I look in databases, you can see there's that identity database that I was working with. I want to delete that database from here also. When I do that, I'll get an error message about unable to open the physical file, which I know that's a problem. I deleted that MDF, but after doing this, if I refresh the list of databases, that database is now gone. And I could also clean up some of these other databases that are not being used. I'll get an error on each one because the MDFs are gone, but it is removing that entry from SQL Server. And now I should be able to run the application again and not have this error. I still won't be able to log in because there's no user information in the database, but I'll need to go and register. And now if I come back out to Visual Studio and refresh, that database was created anew. So just be careful deleting SQL Server database files from the app data folder. If you do that, you may need to go into SQL Server and also remove that database from the catalog of databases that SQL Server knows about. But now that we know where the database is, how we can control the name of the database and where it's going to live, let's take a look at some of the components that interact with that database.